It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Mark, a young tourist from the United States, found himself standing in front of Buckingham Palace, the iconic residence of the British monarch. He had always dreamed of visiting London, and now that he was finally here, the excitement was undeniable. Mark had spent days exploring the city's top tourist spots, the Tower of London, the London Eye, and Big Ben. But none of these attractions quite captured his attention like the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Mark had heard countless stories about the King's Guards, those stoic soldiers who stand at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. Everyone knew they had an air of mystery about them. They were famous for never smiling, never reacting to anything, and never being distracted. To many tourists, this unblinking, impassive nature was both intimidating and fascinating. As Mark walked closer to the palace gates, he could see the guards standing motionless in their designated positions. They looked as though they were statues, and the thought of someone being able to make them react seemed almost impossible. That's when a mischievous thought crossed Mark's mind. What if he could be the one to make them blink, smile, or even break their serious expressions? What if, for once, someone could test the true limits of their stoic nature? Mark wasn't sure why, but the idea made him feel bold. He had always been the type to enjoy challenges, whether it was climbing the tallest mountain, trying an extreme sport, or doing something out of the ordinary. And now it seemed like the perfect opportunity to test his own theory. Could the King's Guards truly stand perfectly still no matter what? He was about to find out. He glanced around and noticed that there were a few other tourists milling about, taking pictures, chatting, and admiring the scene. A group of people stood near a set of benches, watching the guards with fascination. Mark could see the quiet respect in their eyes as they observed the soldiers, but there was also a sense of curiosity. Everyone wanted to know if these guards could be provoked in any way. Mark began to think that perhaps he was the only one who dared to do something about it. As he stood there staring at one of the guards, the idea began to seem more and more exciting. What if he could get a guard to laugh? Or maybe even move? Mark had watched countless videos on social media of tourists attempting to make the guards laugh, with mixed results. Some were successful, others were immediately reprimanded. But the challenge was there, and he felt a sense of pride that he might be the one to succeed where others had failed. It was a game, a puzzle, and Mark loved puzzles. His friends, who had been with him in London for the past few days, had heard about the challenge too. As they walked by the palace gates, Mark shared his idea with them. "I bet I can make one of them react," he said, grinning. His friends laughed at first, but they were curious too. "Go for it," one of them encouraged. "Let's see if you can do it." Mark's confidence grew. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that it would be easy. After all, he had a way with people. He was charming and full of energy, and he believed that this challenge would be no different from anything else he had ever done. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Mark studied the guard closely. He could tell that the soldier's posture was flawless, standing tall with his feet spread apart just the right distance. His shoulders were squared, and his expression was one of total concentration. There was something mesmerizing about the guard's perfect stillness, and Mark felt a surge of excitement. It was like standing in front of a living statue. But Mark was determined to break that stillness. He was convinced that if he could get close enough and do something strange or silly, he would see that guard smile or show a hint of amusement. It was a ridiculous thought, but the thrill of the challenge made it all the more enticing. Mark began to edge closer to the guard, trying to be as discreet as possible. He didn't want to draw too much attention to himself at first, but soon he found himself standing just a few feet away. The guard didn't move. He was still as stone, staring straight ahead with laser-like focus. Mark's heart started to race as he moved even closer, now standing in the guard's direct line of sight. His friends were a little further back, laughing and whispering excitedly. They had no idea what would happen, but they were eager to see the outcome of this bold move. With a sense of mischief, Mark waved his hand in front of the guard's face. There was no response. The guard didn't flinch, blink, or even acknowledge that Mark was standing right in front of him. Mark's grin widened. He was starting to feel like he was on the verge of something big. If the guard didn't react now, surely it would only be a matter of time. So Mark began to make silly faces. He stuck out his tongue, crossed his eyes, and wiggled his fingers in front of the guard's face, all in an attempt to break his composure. Still, there was nothing. The guard was like a rock. Nothing could move him. Feeling a bit more daring, Mark took a few more steps toward the guard, now standing so close that he could practically hear the soft rustle of the guard's uniform. He raised his eyebrows exaggeratedly, puffed out his cheeks, and made a dramatic bowing sound with his mouth, hoping that something, anything, would get a reaction. But nothing. Absolutely nothing. The guard stood still, his eyes never leaving the horizon, his face as serious as ever. At this point, Mark was starting to feel like he might be losing the game, but that only fueled his determination. He couldn't let this challenge go unsolved. So he thought, why not take it one step further? He carefully stepped to the side, then behind the guard, trying to position himself in a way that might be more unexpected. Maybe if he caught the guard off guard, he could get that elusive reaction. He continued with his antics, making even more ridiculous noises and gestures. It seemed to Mark that the crowd was beginning to notice his actions. Some tourists were now watching him, trying to figure out what he was doing. A few were even taking videos, possibly sharing in the amusement of seeing a tourist engage in a challenge that, to them, seemed utterly impossible. Mark was almost laughing at how absurd it was. He truly believed that it would just be a matter of time before the guard cracked. But he had no idea how wrong he was. As Mark continued his antics in front of the king's guard, he couldn't help but feel a little bit like a performer in the spotlight. His confidence was growing by the second. Tourists were starting to notice him, whispering among themselves and taking videos of the unusual scene. It was like a show, and Mark was the star, while the guard played the role of the unshakable, unmoving object. At first, Mark had been a bit uncertain, unsure whether this challenge would actually work. But with every passing moment, as the guard stood perfectly still without even a twitch, Mark became more determined. It was like a game now, a test. Who could outlast the other, him or the guard? The idea of making the guard smile or even react in any way was becoming more thrilling with each passing second. Mark took a deep breath, suddenly feeling a rush of energy. He wasn't just going to make funny faces anymore. He was going to go all in. He took a few steps back, making sure the guard still couldn't see what he was planning. Mark was a master of pranks back home, and he was about to bring that skill to London. With his heart racing and a smile creeping onto his face, he leaned in slightly, whispering loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Bet you can't even move a muscle," he whispered, giving the guard a challenge he would never respond to. But still, nothing. The guard didn't flinch, didn't look his way, didn't even seem to hear him. Mark couldn't believe it. "Okay, this is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, still grinning. "I'm about to make this guy blink." Mark began to try something else. He took a few steps to the side of the guard, getting closer to the line of sight. He knew the guard's peripheral vision might be his weak spot. Maybe, just maybe, if Mark got close enough, made a face right in front of his eyes, the guard would finally break character. Mark quickly began to wave his hands in exaggerated, silly motions, pretending to be a circus performer. His eyes twinkled with mischief as he watched the crowd of tourists behind him, some of them now chuckling at his attempts. His movements became more outlandish. He twirled around, making the motion of a dance that would have looked ridiculous in any context. But as before, the guard remained unmoving. Mark began to make exaggerated sound effects too, trying to amuse the tourists who were laughing behind him. "Whoosh!" he shouted, as if making a dramatic wind sound. "Bam!" He followed up with another sound effect mimicking a crash. Nothing. Not even a flicker of an eye. Mark could feel the pressure mounting like he was in a silent showdown, but it wasn't going the way he expected. There was no way he was going to give up, though, not now. He took a few more steps closer, trying everything he could think of to provoke some kind of reaction. He even started making animal noises, pretending to be a monkey, squawking and jumping around the guard. His friends behind him were now in full support, laughing and cheering him on. "You can do it, Mark. Get him to laugh," they shouted, encouraging him to push even further. Mark was feeling the adrenaline rush, convinced that this would be the moment he'd finally succeed. With each failed attempt, he felt more and more like he was on the verge of something huge. The tourists around him were getting a little more curious, gathering into a small crowd, some now recording his every move. Mark didn't mind. He was on a mission, and failure was not an option. It was just a matter of time before the guard's face would crack, he thought. Surely the guard would react eventually. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. But despite all his ridiculous sounds, moves, and faces, The guard's expression didn't change. The soldier's eyes stayed locked ahead, his body rigid and perfectly still. The challenge was becoming more frustrating than fun. Mark's arms were starting to get tired from all the exaggerated gestures, but he refused to let up. This was bigger than him now. It was about proving a point. He was sure he was going to win this. After all, how long could someone really hold out? That's when something caught his eye. A small shift. Not in the guard, but in the crowd behind him. A couple of security officers were quietly walking toward the area. Mark didn't notice them at first, but when they started to circle the perimeter of the guard and the tourists, he felt a little unease in his gut. For the first time, Mark began to wonder if he might be crossing a line. He had heard about how serious the British Army was about their guards, but it had never crossed his mind that what he was doing might actually be taken as disrespect. Still, he wasn't backing down now. The more the security officers moved toward the scene, the more it seemed like a challenge. The eyes of the security personnel weren't on him at first, but Mark could tell they were observing the situation carefully. He didn't stop. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Mark's antics continued. He took a step back and turned his back to the guard, pretending to struggle with an invisible rope, making it look like he was stuck in a crazy situation. He was hoping to get the guard to react, but there was nothing. It was as if the soldier wasn't even human, just a part of the scenery, one that could not be influenced by anything. This was truly no ordinary challenge. Mark was beginning to think that perhaps there was something even more powerful about these guards than he had realized. They weren't just soldiers. They were the embodiment of discipline and commitment. Meanwhile, the crowd around Mark was growing bigger. More people were drawn in by the strange scene, captivated by Mark's efforts and the unwavering stillness of the guard. Mark could feel the eyes of everyone around him. Some were laughing at his silly behavior, others were simply curious. And that's when the first hint of doubt crept into his mind. What if this wasn't the right thing to do? What if he was actually upsetting the guard? But before he could stop and think about it any longer, something shifted again. The guards didn't break their silence, but the security officers were now closing in, moving directly toward him. They hadn't said anything yet, but Mark could feel the shift in the air. There was a serious energy around them. He took a final glance at the guard, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a fun challenge. This was something deeper, something that required respect. But it was too late to turn back now. The challenge was still on, and he was determined to see it through. The longer Mark stood there, the more the tension in the air began to shift. At first, he had been fully caught up in the excitement of the challenge. It felt like a playful game, a harmless test of the guard's composure. But now, as he glanced around at the growing crowd and the approaching security officers, the reality of the situation started to sink in. The tourists who had been laughing and cheering him on were starting to watch more carefully. Some looked concerned, and a few even began whispering amongst themselves, unsure if Mark's actions were crossing a line. The once fun atmosphere now felt a little uncomfortable. Mark's heart was racing. He still didn't want to back down. After all, he had come this far and couldn't leave without seeing how far he could push this. But the doubts were starting to grow. What if he had done something wrong? He had seen the stern expressions of the guards before, but he never thought that what he was doing might upset them or the security. Could he actually be in trouble? The thought barely crossed his mind before he quickly pushed it aside. No way. He'd come this far and there was no turning back now. He was determined to make the guard react no matter what. Mark took a deep breath and tried to refocus. The more he looked at the guard, the more he noticed how disciplined the soldier was. The guard's posture was perfect. Straight-backed, shoulders squared, feet planted firmly on the ground. His eyes remained fixed ahead, unwavering. To anyone else, it may have seemed like the soldier was simply standing still, doing his job. But Mark could see there was more to it. The guard wasn't just standing. He was deeply focused, locked in on his role. It was clear that the soldier had trained for this moment, for this kind of stillness. It wasn't just a job. It was a commitment. Mark had always admired people who could dedicate themselves to something completely. It was clear that the guard was more than just a figurehead in a red uniform. This was a soldier with years of experience, with a job to do that demanded absolute focus and professionalism. It wasn't about being funny or entertaining for the tourists. It was about duty. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the increasing presence of security personnel around the area. The security officers were now moving closer to the scene. At first they seemed to be casually observing the situation, but Mark could feel their eyes on him. He knew he had to be careful now. The playful game he had started was slowly turning into something more serious. It was as if the guards and the security officers had silently communicated with each other, and now it was clear that Mark had reached the limit. The seriousness in the air was unmistakable. Mark turned slightly, trying to gauge the situation. The crowd around him had also become quieter. A few people were still recording, but their faces had changed from amusement to curiosity. No one seemed to know what was going to happen next. Mark's friends were still standing behind him, though they too had fallen quiet. They no longer seemed as excited or supportive as they had been earlier. They were watching, just as unsure about the situation as Mark was beginning to feel. Then one of the security officers stepped forward. He was a tall man, his uniform crisp and his expression stern. He looked directly at Mark and gave him a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. That was enough to make Mark's stomach tighten. The guard's unflinching composure was one thing, but now there were real consequences for his actions. It wasn't just the guard who had been trained to remain unfazed. It was the entire team of professionals who were watching over the palace, making sure everything was in order. The officer didn't speak yet, but his presence alone was enough to make Mark pause. He realized that perhaps he had gone too far. The moment of fun had shifted, and he now saw that the guard wasn't just someone to play around with. There was more at stake here. The king's guards weren't part of a performance for tourists. They were soldiers, tasked with protecting the royal family and the palace. It wasn't a job that could be interrupted for amusement. Mark's mind was racing. He hadn't thought this far ahead. In his excitement, he hadn't considered the seriousness of the situation. Now the reality was hitting him hard. He took a step back, glancing at the security officer again. The officer hadn't said anything, but his eyes were cold and alert, making it clear that he was not impressed by what Mark had been doing. Mark was no longer in control of the situation. The power had shifted, and he was suddenly aware of how quickly things could escalate. Feeling the weight of the officer's gaze, Mark decided to slowly back off. He wasn't going to stop completely, though. He wasn't ready to admit that he had lost, but as he stepped back, he noticed something. The guard, who had remained utterly unmoved throughout the entire ordeal, seemed to shift slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch Mark's attention. The soldier's eyes remained focused, but for the first time there was a faint hint of a glimmer. Was it a twitch, a blink? Mark couldn't be sure. It was so subtle it could have been a trick of the light. But in that brief moment, Mark felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe he hadn't failed after all. Maybe the guard wasn't as impervious as he had first thought. Mark looked around quickly, feeling a little foolish for getting his hopes up. But as the security officer stepped closer to him, his hand resting on his radio, Mark knew that the game was over. The guard had won. The soldiers had won. The professionalism and poise of the King's Guard had remained unshaken. Mark took one final look at the guard. There was no smile, no reaction, no sign of any emotion, just a soldier standing tall, performing his duty with unwavering dedication. The guard hadn't blinked, hadn't laughed, and hadn't even seemed to notice Mark's antics. And in that moment, Mark realized that the King's Guard was not there for entertainment. They were there for a much more important reason. As Mark slowly turned away, his face a mixture of disappointment and respect, he couldn't help but feel a bit of admiration for the guard. Despite everything, the soldier had remained calm and composed. There was a strength in that silence. It wasn't the reaction Mark had hoped for, but it was the response he needed. And as he walked away, Mark understood that some challenges were never meant to be won. Some tests were about learning to appreciate the things we often take for granted.